Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My name is Rishtia Kakar, and I would like to welcome you all to the first session in our three-part workshop series on child sexual abuse. Thank you so much for being here, every single one of you, and for being on time so that we can get started as well. And before I get started, I would like to say that this endeavor is the first workshop of a new project that Ustaza Aisha Khattak, many of you might know her, some of you might not. And this project is called SOS, and you might have seen that in the introduction videos that we had. So at the end of this workshop, we will actually be telling you more about the SOS project and what exactly it has to do with this topic, as well as many other topics that you all might be interested in. So please do stay tuned for that, inshallah, at the end of this workshop series. So, as you just saw in that promo video, I've been researching this topic within the Muslim community for a couple of years through doing my PhD research, and I've really found some key avenues that we have to be hopeful with, right? About this difficult and complicated topic. So I really hope to be able to share that with you over the next 3 sessions. Now, but before we even get there, one of the things that is actually the most hopeful is that we have over 250 participants who registered for these workshop sessions, which is above and beyond the response we were expecting, right? And that's truly something to be hopeful about. The fact that both men and women from our communities are seeking the opportunities to learn about this very painful and complicated issue. And so with that hope that we can change something, that this is the beginning of a change, let's start, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And before we go on into the topic specifically, I would like to play a passage from the Quran, Surah Taha, which is Surah number 20, ayah 24 to 35. And as I play it with the translation, I would love to have all of you think about how is this relevant to our discussion over the next 3 sessions. To give you the context of this passage, Prophet Musa alayhi salam is on the mount, and he's talking to Allah Azza wa Jal and finding out for the first time that he is a messenger, and he has a huge responsibility. A responsibility to go and confront Fir'aun, the most powerful and the most oppressive person of his time, who had done horrible things to women and children that we hear about in the Quran. And at the time, Prophet Musa alayhi salam himself is a fugitive in the land. And now he has been given this task that seems seemingly impossible to do. How could he do this from the worldly sense? And yet in this passage that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has preserved for us, we get to see how Musa alayhi salam responds, and we get to learn from the immense wisdom in his perspective on such a situation. So let's try to understand that. How is this related to our topic today, inshallah?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
اذهب إلى فرعون إنه طغى قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي واجعل لي وزيرا من أهلي هارون أخي أشدد به أزري وأشركه في أمري كي نسبحك كثيرا ونذكرك كثيرا إنك كنت بنا بصيرا قال قد أوتيت سؤلك يا موسى.
So the passage that I just played, actually I was talking about that it had meant personally a lot to me to help guide and center me during my research and work in this area. So we will actually come back to that passage in the following 2 sessions as well and look into it in more depth. And then coming to the slide about the disclaimers. Before we start our presentation today, there are a few disclaimers that I would like to share. First, this can be a very sensitive issue that can bring up very strong emotional reactions or triggers for anyone. So it's important to make sure that each of you are in a safe place, that you're emotionally and physically safe to listen to this talk. And if at any time you feel too strongly triggered, please know that you can close this video. Don't feel compelled to stay. Please take care of your emotional health first. And then next, we have a very mixed audience today. That means we have victims, we have family members or friends of victims, and we have general caring community members. So for this reason, let's make sure that in our chat discussion, we use caring and supportive language, while at the same time, the majority of us maybe are in Pakistan, while many others are also joining from all other countries as well. So finally, during this talk, I want to be clear that I will be using very clear and explicit language in order to make sure that this issue is addressed in a straightforward and very clear way with the purpose of educating community members about this issue. So if you have children that are younger than 15, this talk may not be appropriate for them, and you may want to choose to listen through headphones, so that is not audible to them. All right, so this talk is supposed to be an interactive workshop format, but I really, it's very hard to do this kind of format online, and especially when we had such a large audience register. But we are going to try to do a few things. First, if you do have questions, please note that we will not be able to answer or address them in this session, but we will try to answer them in another session. So please, you can either forward them to the WhatsApp number or to this email address, or if you write them in the chat box, the moderators will be collecting them as well for a later time. But to engage you a little bit, because I am a teacher and I do like to engage those who are listening, that at different points in the workshop, I will be asking you some questions for you to answer in the comment section. For example, what was the most important point so far? What was the most surprising fact you learned? And what did you learn that changed your mind? So please, as I'm talking, be thinking about these, and you can even note them down so that you will be able to write them in the comment section when I ask the question. And then finally, we will be stopping at around 10 minutes until the next hour so that we can have a prayer break. For some of you, it will be Asr prayer break. For some of us, it will be Fajr prayer break. But we will have a 10-minute prayer break at that time, inshallah. Okay, so, all right. So in order to go ahead with the public health perspective, since my training is in public health, we will be approaching it from that perspective in this first session. And if you can remember one thing about the public health perspective, I want you to remember the question that we always want to keep asking why. Keep asking why, all right? So to explain this perspective, I'd like to share an analogy with you, an in-depth analogy. And we'll be using this analogy throughout these workshop series to guide our discussion. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this to explain it. Now, all of us know how a tree trunk grows, right? Let's take the example of a tree. And in this analogy, the trunk of the tree represents the problem or the issue that's growing. And in this top, it's child sexual abuse. Now, how big is the trunk of that tree? And how, some parts are above ground, right, that we can see, but others are buried below ground. We can't really see the full extent of the issue in this community. But generally, when you do see a tree, what's the first part? If you look outside, if you're able to look outside and it's light out, what's the first part of the tree that makes you notice it clearly? The first part is almost always those branches, those leaves, right? How big is a tree? We decide it by the branches and leaves. And it's those leaves and branches that actually, in this situation, represent the consequences or the effects of child sexual abuse in our community. It's only after, letting the issue grow for a long time and not addressing it that what happens is we suddenly start seeing all these effects. We only notice it when we see those leaves and those branches of the effects, and we don't even though the whole time it was actually going on, but we were actually just ignoring the problem and thinking it's not going to have such bad effects anyways. So, but the thing is that, these effects, what happens is we often get so focused on them, right? So figuring out how to help and reduce the effects of child sexual abuse is very important. And actually, that's what we're going to be talking about in our third session. What are the evidence-based things that can help to reduce the effects of child sexual abuse? However, at the same time, we need to realize that there is a lot more to a tree. It doesn't just start coming up above ground with what we can see, right? There is something deeper. What's deeper? It's the roots. So when we take a step back and really ask that public health question that I mentioned, the question of why. What is making it grow so strong and so fast? Why is child sexual abuse happening? Then we can start to figure out the roots of the tree, what we like to call in public health often the risk factors. And now, you might have heard me say, I said we're going to keep asking the question why. Because it's not always enough to know about this tree, or the tree roots, the risk factors. It doesn't always give us a complete picture. Because what would happen? Look at this picture. If you take out the tree from the roots even, we might think that we've succeeded. But can't another tree grow in its place? Right? So if we dig deeper, we find out and keep asking the question why, as I mentioned, we need to ask what is in the soil? What are the nutrients? What is causing this tree to grow here in the first place? Why was this soil and this area so perfect for this ugly, ugly tree of child sexual abuse? And only when we are asking those correct questions, only then can we know why it's really happening in the first place and try to address it from the root of the problem. And we have to understand that this is specific for each community, right? We might know generally what makes this tree, what makes this issue of child sexual abuse grow, but it's going to grow a little differently and have some reasons that are just going to be a little bit different in each community. Whether that's the values, whether that's the culture, whether that's the religion, whatever those are, they are the factors that are also important to understand. And oftentimes we think that we can just apply everything that we learn in a different community into one that might be very different. So we need to be aware of that as well. So, why did I spend so much time on this? Because, inshallah, in today's presentation, we are going to go into the details of each of these 4 levels, each of these 4 questions, to really understand the issue of child sexual abuse and why it happens. And then once we, as a community in this group together, have understood these 4 things, then in the next session, we can go on to discuss how we're going to prevent it while intervening at each of these levels. Right? And then in the last session, we'll discuss in depth what can we do to stop the effects? How can we help those and heal those who have been affected by it? So, to start off with our first question, how big is the trunk of this tree really? How much of an issue is child sexual abuse really? And just for your information, if you might see some names and some dates on the corner, these are the references that I've used for the various slides. So, I want you to imagine hearing the news that scientists had found a new disease with many serious side effects. Now, this is something that's probably easy for us to imagine right now. And among these this disease that's happened with many serious long-term side effects, 300 million children around the world have been exposed. 300 million children. Now that's a very hard number to comprehend. But it's equal, this number, 300 million, if we put all those children together, it would be equal to the 4th largest country in the world. That's larger than the entire population of Pakistan. And the truth is that we do have such a disease that children have already been exposed to. This many children have already been exposed to. And that is child sexual abuse. So, what is child sexual abuse? We first need to know this before we go further, right? The first question we might ask is, who is a child? And a child is often defined differently in each culture and time period. There are different legal definitions. There's developmental science definitions for different eras. But whatever the definition used, sexual abuse is an aggression, an oppression on that person. And whatever the age of the child, there's no responsibility because they are the victim. They are the one who the aggression is being done to. For the purposes of this presentation, because most of the data we have and the statistics that we have uses the definition of child up to age 16 or 18, we will be using that. Now, the next question is, why is it called abuse? Anytime a person exploits someone else, exploits a vulnerability that they see in someone else, that is called abuse. And abuse happens when there is a difference in the position or the power position between the offender and the victim. This is a crucial point. It only happens when there is a difference in the position or power between the abuser and the victim. So when someone uses their position or their power or their authority over someone to take advantage of that, that is called abuse. Now, as a reminder, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be using clear and explicit language and clear and explicit examples in the following section. So sexual abuse is any act that is done for the purpose of sexual gratification. This may either be immediate or it can even be achieved later after the act is being done. And child sexual abuse can happen once for a few minutes, or it is actually very common for child sexual abuse to last for many years. How? Due to the trust that is developed with the child. You will hear this key word of trust coming up again and again. So now we're going to be talking about these several types of child sexual abuse. All of these are important to know about and to recognize as forms of abuse. And it's important to recognize that each of these types can happen to either girls or boys. So in the first type of abuse, sexual abuse, we come to the one that's called non-contact. Now this includes exposing the child to sexually explicit images or information. For example, undressing in front of a child, showing them their body parts, their genitals, or asking the child to watch something specific that they are doing, or showing porn to the child, which is actually a very common first step in child sexual abuse. And this is often the one that people don't really think about when this topic comes up. They think, well, what's a really big deal about that? But I want everyone to know here, this is definitely a form of child sexual abuse, and it does have traumatic effects on the child. So it's common for, the other thing about non-contact abuse is that it's common for it to be the first stage of child sexual abuse, and then it can progress further. For example, the abuser might tell the child to, after they got comfortable getting them to watch the porn or to see different things with them, then they start telling them to act out the porn or telling them to touch them once they have been undressed. In the next type, we go on to contact. Contact child sexual abuse includes any kind of touching of the child that is done with sexual intentions or asking the child to touch them. Some examples of this can be, for example, one that's done very commonly is getting under the blanket. While they're under the same blanket, maybe there are even other adults around, other people, but yet they are touching the child in a way. They're fondling a body part of the child in different ways. This could also happen in very open places that we see all the time, happening in the market, to children, to girls, even boys, or happening in the car when there's a driver with them, a bus driver or a taxi driver. Is it just touching here and there? No, this is child sexual abuse. This is traumatic for the child. It changes their brain development, as we will see later on. Now, the next type of child sexual abuse is forced intercourse. This includes oral, vaginal, or anal, or any attempt at forced intercourse, maybe in either girls or boys. You may have noticed that forced intercourse is the type that people usually think of when the topic of child sexual abuse comes up. And unfortunately, the first question you may hear a victim or family member be asked is, when they hear about it, well, was it rape? Did that actually happen? And I want to tell you, this is a very problematic and in fact harmful thought process, because it makes people think that child sexual abuse is only really serious if forced intercourse occurred. So we end up burying all the other types of child sexual abuse, despite the fact that all of those also lead to traumatic effects in the child. And it's these kinds of misconceptions, these kinds of harmful thought processes that also lead to well-meaning parents thinking, well, I took my child to the doctor and they didn't see anything. The doctor didn't find anything. So that means there must be no abuse. This is not true. In the vast majority of child sexual abuse cases, there are absolutely no signs that a general doctor would be able to find on examination. I'm going to say that again so everyone can understand. In the vast majority of child sexual abuse cases, a general doctor would not be able to find any signs on their examination. So please, let's move away from these thought processes and let's understand the full scope of this issue so that we can support and help those who have been affected by it. And the last thing is that, of course, child sexual abuse can be a combination of these as well. So, for example, each of these might not happen alone, and oftentimes they progress from one type to the next type to the final. All right. Now, to go on, something that I've heard often when I'm doing my work and in my research is, well, child sexual abuse doesn't really happen in Muslim countries, or, that's only a Western thing. Or even here in the US, I've heard, well, that's only in poor countries, or it's only in certain groups. So no matter where you go, everyone always thinks it's somewhere else. But from the many years of research that have been done, 30 years of research, it's clear that child sexual abuse is a widespread issue present globally within all societies and across all ethnic, socioeconomic, and religious groups. What does that mean? There is no community that is not affected by this yet. And, when we see this, I will ask you to think about the question that I've been saying, why? Why? Why is it across all of these? What is it that's similar across all these communities? And this is the question that we will get back to at the very end of today's session. But for those of you who are interested in the evidence on this statement, how can I be saying this? How can I be sure about this? Because we know that there's no official data from Pakistan. Well, there has been over 30 years of data collected. And here I show 3 meta-analysis studies that have compiled all of these. And we see that there's studies from 24 different countries, from 6 continents, and with a total of 10 million participants that have been studied. And that is how we can come to the understanding of how common child sexual abuse is really. So it's important to note, that I mentioned we don't have official data from child sexual abuse in Pakistan. In fact, many, many countries. And even the official data that does exist, we'll explain later, is not at all, it cannot be trustworthy exactly. So from that data that I just showed you, we can estimate. And we estimate that if there are 4 girls, 1 out of every 4 or 5 girls will be sexually abused before they reach the age of 18. And in boys, 1 out of every 8, sometimes 10 boys is sexually abused before the age of 18. So it's important to recognize that in the research, male victims are much less likely to tell anyone about the abuse. So we really don't have good data on child sexual abuse that's happening in boys. And the research does show that there are some specific places that have higher risk for boys. For example, lower resource countries. For example, in specific areas like sporting organizations, religious institutions, and in the trucking industry. These are all higher risk for boys. But in the general population, girls are 2 or 3 times more likely to be affected by child sexual abuse. So, among all of the sexual violence that has been reported in one study that was looked at, this surprised me, that 70% of all the cases of sexual violence, including adults and children, 70% were in children, meaning that sexual abuse occurs more than double the amount in children than it does in adults. And an important understanding of the age is that it can occur at any age, from newborn to teenage. Yes, newborn. 1-year-olds, yes. And the majority of child sexual abuse most commonly starts in children younger than 13 years old. And what do I mean by starting? So most commonly, let's say the age of starting might be around 9 to 10 years old. But when I say starting, it means that it can continue for many years. And we know that the risk of child sexual abuse actually increases with each age, with each year. And another interesting fact is that child sexual abuse is actually much more common or higher risk in those who have disabilities, physical disabilities such as deafness or other kinds of disabilities. And we have to think about why is that the case as well. So what we're going to do now is, as I mentioned, have that question. So you'll have a timer on the screen. There's a timer that's going to start for 1 minute. And I'd like for all of you to write one simple thing, one fact that you felt was the most important thing you learned so far. I just mentioned that the comments that we received of what the most important point was were very helpful, and I really appreciated that all of you were listening very attentively. Thank you so much. Let's continue doing that. So, who are the people who commit child sexual abuse? This is our next question. Who does it? Now, I think it is commonly known that the overwhelming majority of abusers are male. That means 95 to 99% of abusers are male. But at the same time, it's important to not think that women are completely safe from it. Often, female abusers are actually not discussed or not reported because people don't consider it to be real abuse. So we actually don't really know how common female abuse actually is. So the other important thing to understand is that abusers can either be adults or actually teenagers, children themselves. So a substantial chunk of abusers are in their adolescence or teens, people who you might consider to be children as well. So it's crucial to take necessary precautions between children as well, separating out their beds, separating out their blankets, and making sure that they're not bathing together, things like that, right? We'll talk about all of those, inshallah, in the next workshop. The next thing is that around the world, this is not just an issue in Pakistan, but all around the world, the media reports on child sexual abuse only when some very big case happens. It skews the perception of the public to thinking only that kind of person is an offender. Does that make sense? While, actually the reality of the situation is that the offenders are almost always known to the family. And what kinds of people do we know? People who we trust. So, in fact, in one study in Australia, when they interviewed the abusers, 70% said that the parents knew the abuser was with the victim. Now, you might have also heard the term stranger danger. And when teaching children, we often use this, right? But actually, for this it's for this reason that the abusers are almost always known to the family, that stranger danger is actually not helpful in preventing child sexual abuse at all. In fact, there's been some studies, some research shows they've been looking into whether it may actually do more harm than good, because it teaches the child that anyone who is not a stranger is safe to be around and you can be comfortable with them, when in fact it is actually those from the research that are the ones who take the most advantage of this issue and commit the abuse. Another issue is that oftentimes people think that child abusers are what they call pedophiles. Now, the term pedophile means that someone has a sexual interest in children and only children, they're attracted to them. But this is not true. The research shows this is not true. They do not. Instead, the ones who commit child sexual abuse is because they have a desire to show their power and control over the child. So we need to get out of this mindset as well and understand who really are child sexual abusers. Now, the next question is, what about where does it occur? Exactly what are the roles of the people who are doing this? Now, it's important to note that there has not been any extensive research in Muslim households. So this is from other communities and my own research interviews that I've been doing in the Muslim community. So if we divide the types of people who do it into being those who are within the victim's household or those who are outside the victim's household. And when I say household, usually in the literature it's talked about within a family. But we know that for our types of households and families, there might be other people who are living in the house and who have access to the house who are not only family members. So for example, for specifically in our communities, uncles have been seen to be a very common abuser. And stepfathers in every community, cousins, siblings, and for us, workers at home, whether that's the maids, the cooks, the babysitters, the drivers. And then for us specifically, we have to understand that there is a higher risk when many people live or work within the home. That's what I found in my research. What about outside the home? What kinds of people? And just one thing I wanted to say, just backtracking a little bit, is that, within this household, if you look at these, again, it's people who you trust. And oftentimes what happens is the family is not going to believe that their own family members or people who are within their household can abuse. So this is why this awareness and this understanding is so crucial. If you look at the literature and the research, and these are the common people who are doing it, we have to bring awareness about this. So the next thing is that on the other hand, when child sexual abuse is done by someone outside the household, it is most commonly done by someone who has a quasi-parental role. What does that mean? It means that it's done by the people who hold trusted positions of authority and are in caretaking roles where they can be, emotionally or physically close to the child, such as those who are in schools, madrasas, sporting, right? So it's all of these kinds of locations where the person is trusted by the family and the parents. So the child also then begins to trust those people. And in fact, they have such a strong role. And I'll tell you an example from my research that there have been several children who have explained that who is going to believe me over my Quran teacher? Or people who have run away from a madrasa or a school or a specifically extracurricular activity and keep telling their parents, I don't want to go to that. I don't want to go there, to that sporting activity or that event, not realizing that the coach or someone else there is the ones who are abusing. So there's some differences. Now within the household, those who are committing abuse are more likely to have repeated abuse of the 1 to 2 victims, and the victims are often younger. So those repeated abuse, what does that mean? And this was pretty surprising. In the research, it shows that when they are within the household, the average time the average number of incidents of abuse that are done to that one child is 43 times. And then in the general, outside the household, in public, while in general, they tend to abuse many more victims. So there might not just be one or two victims, but there might be many more victims, and there would be one or two offenses against each victim. So for example, on average, they might have up to 73 victims, one person. So across all of this, it's important to understand that the most common places that child sexual abuse happens is most often within the home or vehicle of the offender or the victim. So it's almost always in a private location where there's no other adults. And in fact, the research has shown that if there is adult around somewhere, even if they're not related, that it can actually prevent the abuse. And the next is that we have to remember that there is extreme online access to children. So whether it's within the household or outside the household, don't forget the piece of the online access. That's how they can access it very easily. All right, so inshallah, I've been told that we're going to take a 10-minute break now for Asr prayer in Pakistan and Fajr prayer in the US. So we will join back in exactly 10 minutes. Please make sure that exactly at the hour, the new hour exactly, we will start back inshallah. And in the meanwhile, we will have a prayer break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. So we are back from our prayer break. I hope everyone had a beneficial prayer break, and inshallah it adds barakah to our session as well. So before we left off, we were on this slide, and the thing that I forgot to emphasize is that what is the takeaway from this slide? The takeaway is that whether the abuser is in the household or outside the household, it's very important to understand the vast majority of abusers are those who the family and the children trust. And throughout my research, this theme of trusting the abuser was a very, very common theme. So that's why I'm emphasizing it here as a takeaway, inshallah. All right, so let's go on, inshallah. The next question, we talked about what is abuse exactly, and then we talked about who exactly is the abuser. Now let's discuss the next question of how does abuse really start and continue. Now, this is where the concept of grooming comes in that you might have heard about. So, no matter what the type of abuser, who the abuser is, the research shows that they put considerable effort into manipulating the child and the child's family in order to commit the abuse and in order to gain trust. So it's not just a one-time thing for the majority of the time, because as we said, that concept of trust, how are they gaining that trust? And the way they do that is through efforts, through this manipulation. And that's what grooming is. So grooming is when the abuser works to develop trust and emotional connection with a child and even their friends and family to make them seem trustworthy and authoritative to the child. And with their intention being to reduce the child's inhibitions and to prepare the child for sexual activity. So how do they do that? They may try to isolate children from their friends and family, making them feel dependent on the abuser, and that gives the abuser power and control, right? So they tell them different stories, they show them different things that are going to get them to trust them and move away from their friends and family. They may also often, very often, introduce the idea of secrets with the child. So let me tell you a secret, you can't tell your parents, and let's start off with something very small, very, very seemingly something that's not that bad, right? But they start off with that, and then it grows and grows and grows. And eventually then exposing them to sexual material, telling them, oh, don't tell your parents don't want you to know. This is just a secret between you and I because I love you so much, because whatever reason. We're such good friends, you're my best friend, right? And oftentimes, grooming frequently starts online, especially nowadays, right? So please, as I'm talking about all of this, don't forget the online component. Don't forget the access that people have to children online. Now, children often don't know that they have been groomed. Why? How? It's a manipulation. They are told that this is their way of showing love and affection. And this is a crucial, crucial point. That it results in complicated feelings for the abuser. It results in the child actually not even recognizing it as abuse. They see it because they've been told that this is love. This is affection. This is something that's secret and good, and even for many abusers, they may even feel good. They may even be forced to their body to feel good in that act. So when a child is asked, I often see this in TV, when they go through some kind of thing like this, where they ask the child, tell me, is anything wrong happening? Is anything uncomfortable happening? The child doesn't recognize it. So they may have complicated feelings, a mix of both fear and distress and confusion mixed with that loyalty and admiration and love. And it's that is actually even more traumatic for the child for their entire life. So let's go on to, what are some grooming techniques? How does it really happen? And I usually don't spend time on this, but specifically because this is for the general public, I feel it's even important to spend time on. So, as I mentioned, there's that issue of showing a special interest in the child, right? So it might be that emotional connection, that trust-developing connection, but a lot of those, you might not be able to tell the difference between someone who actually cares for the child or someone who's doing this. So it's important to understand that when they are giving favors to a child, doing favors to the child, for whatever way, to make the child feel extra special, other than other children, and giving them gifts, right? Finding that children have gifts from someone who you don't know who they're from, but all of that leading to the abuser trying to spend time alone with the child. That is the key feature, right? That is the crux of the grooming. So once they've developed that emotional and trust part of the grooming, how does it progress beyond that? These are not all necessary to happen, but these are some examples. They might find ways to have the child undress, right? So maybe some kind of harmless activity like massaging or swimming, or purposefully walking in on them when they're changing or taking a bath. And then finding ways to touch their genitals. So, while they're tickling them, but finding ways to do it maybe under a blanket, play with them under the blanket. Or a very common one is playing doctor with them, right? And in that way, finding their genitals and making it seem. And a lot of times children say that, well, my parents were around or adults were around and they saw this person doing this to me, so I thought it was okay. Like, why would I think it's not right? Because we don't recognize it, right? Another very common one is teasing the child about their physical development, right? So, for example, their breast development or their genital development, and commenting on it and noticing it, and the child might think, oh, this person is paying attention to me. They also prepare the child with sexually explicit jokes, right? So, for example, in the guise of trying to educate them, oh, let me tell you something that your parents haven't told you, something that's, and then they learn about all this new information at a time when they're not ready to learn that information developmentally. In the same way, as I mentioned before, showing them porn or showing them different kinds of images. And then it might progress in some cases to taking pictures, right? So taking pictures, having them pose in different positions, in different situations, right? Okay, so these are all some examples. Now, this is related to this next topic of how many children tell someone about the sexual abuse. So as I mentioned, the reason it's important to understand grooming is because first we can see the signs, right? But secondly, we can understand better what the child is growing through. That it's for this reason that they might not recognize it as abuse in many, many cases. So if you have 100 children who have been abused, the research shows that only 1/3 will actually tell someone in their lifetime about that abuse. The majority, 2/3 of children will not tell anyone for many different reasons. And this is actually something that we will go into a lot more detail in the next session of why children don't tell and how can we contradict those thought processes. But just for now, I'm going to ask you this question to have you think about it. Is in the ones who did disclose, the children who did tell, right, who were able to get that courage and go through a lot of difficulty in telling someone, the question is often, what was the response? And what happened? What actually changed? And this is, a question that I want each and every single one of us to think about before we come into the next workshop session about what are we doing about it? Why would children tell us? Is there something that we can do about it? There's no reason for children to tell us if we're not going to do anything. So the next question comes, how many cases of child sexual abuse are actually reported officially? So again, taking that same 100 children who have been abused, if there are 100 children who have been abused, the research shows that only 3 out of 100 cases are actually reported officially. And this is in places where there's actually reports going on. This is not Pakistan. This is more international data. And of those cases, so the majority are never reported officially, right? And of those cases that are reported officially, I want you to think about how many of them do you think actually get any kind of accountability for the abuser. Much, much less than even one. Not even 1/3. It's like 1% out of these 3. So, with all that being said, we can understand the barriers that are going through a child's mind, right? We can understand the barriers, and not only a child's mind, a parent's mind, the mother's mind. What can they do? It seems like a hopeless situation from a mother's perspective, right? Because of everything that we're told and everything that we see and the processes around us, the societal processes around us that are keeping us silent. So we're going to discuss what are all those towards the end. Okay, so again, let's take that minute and think about what's the most important thing you've learned so far in this section, right? So try to write that in the comment section. What are those important things that you've learned so far? Let's write those statements down so that we can remember and we can make sure that we're paying attention attentively. All right, Alhamdulillah, we've gotten through that 1 minute of letting you write down the most important thing, and I saw some comments there; those were really beneficial. And I saw you say that not to trust anyone, right? And that's the question: is how can we go through our lives to make sure that we are still operating normally, right? We still have to go through life and go through all of these different actions in our day-to-day life, but with a mindset that we're aware and we're recognizing the situation before it happens and creating a safe situation for everybody. And that's what we're going to be talking about, inshallah, in the next session. So before I, go on, I want to stop here just a little bit and think about this question, that why isn't child sexual abuse talked about more often? And this is a question I've asked for a long time. As I've been doing my research, I've really been trying to look into this, and there's a very, very long answer to this, and we're going to explore that a lot more next week. But for now, this quote really helped to give me perspective. Sexual abuse doesn't get more attention because it's an uncomfortable subject. We don't want to talk about it. It's ugly. It reveals things about our culture and our society and our community that we don't want to know. But the truth is that by not discussing it, we actually don't identify it as a problem. We don't identify what it really is. And so when we don't speak about it, when we refuse to address it and speak about it, then we actually become part of the problem. Because we're part of a culture that then normalizes it, that makes it okay, and it makes it an invisible problem. And we know that as Muslims, we are all called up to stand up against oppression, to stand up against injustice, even if it's against our own family. We're meant to be people who stand for justice, right? And so the first step is understanding the true nature of the problem and talking about it in the right way. This is a key thing. Oftentimes we try to talk about it, but it ends up being talked about in a very harmful way to the victims and society. So, with that being said, with that little interlude, let's go on. So I told you I'm going to be talking about this analogy and this picture a lot throughout this session. So we just finished covering this first aspect of what is that really true issue? How big is that trunk really, right? And we said that 300 million children around the world, right? So now let's look at the next thing. What are really the consequences or the effects that it has? So we'll start off with this quote. Child maltreatment, that means all kinds of child abuse, that is including sexual abuse, is the single most preventable cause of mental illness and behavioral dysfunction. Now, what does that really mean? Let's look into it. And this includes, by the way, both the effects and the consequences that immediately follow the abuse, and the effects and the consequences that are throughout the victim's adolescence and adulthood. So, looking at the first is psychological health effects. Now, these are things that we are going to talk about in detail with actually a psychological expert in our last session on healing in 2 weeks. But just to start us off, child sexual abuse, childhood trauma, has lasting impacts on the individual's psychological functioning and well-being. So in order to cope with their past experiences with that trauma, the child sexual abuse victims often use denial, self-blame, self-isolation, emotional suppression, and it results in this disconnect between their mind and their body. And it can result in long-term changes in their brain, that biological stress system. This has been shown in the research. And so that's just the general physiological functioning, meaning the normal functioning of the brain. But there are also things that it leads to. It can lead to higher risk of mental health disorders, 5 to 8 times higher risk of mental health disorders in child sexual abuse victims. What kinds of disorders? For example, depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, sleep disorders, right? And in fact, in one of the studies that was a twin study, they found that these kinds of disorders are higher in those who have gone through child sexual abuse, despite all the other factors being the same, the background, the life, everything else being the same. The next is suicidality. Now, it's very important for all of you to know, regardless of child sexual abuse, suicide is one of the top 3 causes of death among 15 to 24-year-olds around the world. Oftentimes we talk about causes of death, for example, cancer or heart disease or malaria, right? But in this age range, in adolescence to young adult, suicide is one of the top 3 causes of death. Now, within child sexual abuse, their association between suicide and child sexual abuse is very strong. And even without other mental health disorders, without having those symptoms, it's been there as well. So that's something we want to be watching out for and always taking care of. And the next is substance use disorders. So this association of substance use disorders is stronger with child sexual abuse than other types of, even without even a family history of it. So it leads to the early onset of substance use in adolescents and young adults, whether that's smoking or marijuana or alcohol. All of those are included in this because they use it it's often seen as a coping mechanism for them. Going on to the physical health effects. So you might think, well, what kinds of physical health effects can childhood sexual abuse have? Well, there has been a lot of 2 decades of research has demonstrated that adverse childhood experiences, any kinds of childhood trauma, are associated with higher risks of physical health issues in adulthood, not just childhood, in adulthood, because it takes that time for it to affect the entire body. And so specific with child sexual abuse, meta-analyses, meaning very high-level studies, have demonstrated that adults with a history of child sexual abuse have poorer overall health, they experience more pain, they have higher rates of obesity, and many other issues such as cardiac issues, gynae issues, gastrointestinal issues, in comparison with the same types of adults who don't have a history of child sexual abuse. And there are many theories for why this happens, and I don't have time to go into that. But another interesting side of physical health effects is the effects on sexual health, and this is not talked about enough in our community for sure. One of these side effects, one of the effects or consequences of child sexual abuse is that it can lead to something what they call pathological hypersexuality. What does that mean? That the child going into, either in childhood or in adolescence or even in adulthood, that's the only way that they've found to cope with certain things, is through hypersexuality. And this often leads to a lot of feeling of guilt, feeling of shame that the victim has to face through going through this, especially in our communities. So, and most people don't even know that this is linked, as in the research proven to be an effect of child sexual abuse. Most people think that, if it's abuse, then maybe they don't want to have sex at all, right? There's like this concept of it's going to reduce their sex drive. And that is true also in many victims. They might have flashbacks of abuse while they're going through intimacy. However, both of these are possible. And by not knowing that it's actually part of their childhood trauma, they don't know that they have to treat the source of it, the cause of it, which is the trauma, right? Because their mind and body has this disconnect. That trauma is stuck in their body, causing the body to act in certain ways. And so we have to get at the root of the problem and fix the trauma in order to fix all these consequences and effects. All right. Now going on to the social consequences. So as I've said, there's been a lot of research done on the psychological and the physical health effects, but not as much has been done on the social consequences. And specifically, there's lacking research in this in our Muslim communities. So, and this is something that I've been looking into in my research as well. But the research does show, the current existing research does show that there are social consequences in terms of how that abuse and that childhood trauma affects the child in their academics or even in their future employment, right? But also, one of the key features that affects their life throughout is this difficulty trusting others, right? Because that trust from a young time in their life was broken. And when they have this difficulty trusting others, it's transferred into different aspects of their life, and specifically in their relationships. So they might have difficulty having good long-term relationships. And then finally, again, something that's not discussed in the research, but something that I've seen across my research, is that when trauma happens, especially in our Muslim communities, it affects the way a child grows up understanding their deen. It affects the way they can relate to their Lord, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even their confidence and their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been affected by this. Imagine that one thing that someone did when they were a child, that kind of trauma, that invasive thing that other people might just dismiss, and look at the effects it has. And as a result, our entire ummah, each and every single one of us is affected by this. We should all be taking this so seriously. One example I have of this is someone told me that they were abused when they were being taught a certain surah in the Quran. And now every time they have to open that surah and recite it, they get extreme flashbacks and they have those severe triggering reactions that it's not possible to read that. Now imagine the consequences of that on someone, along with all of these that we've talked about. And imagine the responsibility that person has in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, based on all these effects and consequences, let's make sure that each and every one of us works in our own community, in our own family, in our own community, to make sure that we never think that, oh, it's just a little bit of touching. What's the big deal? Right now, let's all make a decision. We are going to stop that thought process. Now, the next question is, why am I telling you all this? You might be thinking, well, why are you going into all this detail? Are you just trying to make us feel hopeless? Are you just trying to make us feel so upset about the situation? What are we supposed to do? No. The point of explaining all of this to you is to understand the seriousness of child sexual abuse, to understand those effects that we see and the seriousness of it, and to make sure none of us ever minimize or diminish child sexual abuse or ignore it. That's why I'm sharing all of that with you. But this should not make you feel hopeless. Why? Because there are situations, there are research showing that victims of child sexual abuse do heal. They are resilient. When I say resilient, it means that they are able to function normally in society. 10 to 50%. It's not a hopeless situation. But we have to talk about what are, and in fact, many don't show any of those negative effects until adulthood. So before I go on talking about what makes people gain resiliency, let's first understand that something very crucial. Just because you don't see the effects in a child or even a teenager does not mean that the trauma is not there, that it's not stuck in their body somewhere and it's going to come out later. That does not mean. And the next thing, each and every single one of us, let's understand this. Healing is not linear. What does that mean? Oftentimes we think, okay, the trauma happened. You went to counseling. You should be over it. Why aren't you over it? I've heard this so many times. Just get over it. There is no such thing as getting over childhood trauma. Childhood trauma is a cycle process. The healing from childhood trauma is a cycle. There are times where it gets better and someone heals from it, but there are times when things might trigger it to come out, and then they again have to go through the process of healing. So we need to understand these things so that then we can make sure we are supporting victims to the best of our ability. So, as I mentioned, let's talk about this in a hopeful way, because to be honest, there were a lot of times where I was confused about this situation. Where is the hope? Where is the hope in the situation? And when I read this data, that what is it that makes those victims who are functioning normally resilient? How are they different from those who have more severe effects? This is what gave me hope. So I hope I can do that today too. And inshallah, this is going to be an entire session at the last workshop. The first question comes about the severity of abuse, because there used to be a lot of research that has been done trying to find out what is this. And they thought that it's because of how severe the abuse is, right? That maybe because of forced intercourse or because of how long the abuse lasted, that is what makes some people have more severe effects. Some children have more severe effects. But the vast majority, now that we've looked at all that research, that's not true. It might only have 3% effect on the healing. So this is not true. So then what's the case? What makes it different? Well, the next thing is that if you look at a child and the children and the adults who go through it and they have healing and resiliency, they have qualities of not seeing it as a shame for themselves, not blaming themselves for what happened. This is very crucial. So instead of internalizing what happened and blaming themselves completely and having that guilt and shame for something that was never their fault, but why that happens, we'll talk about as well some other time. Instead, they have very good coping strategies. Okay? So that means that we can help children and victims get there. But there's something even more hopeful. Studies found, they were looking at this and trying to figure it out, and they found that victims often experience this concept of betrayal, right? Especially when the abuser is someone close to them, someone within their family. And that's what we said is the majority of the case. But there's a second betrayal and almost a second type of trauma that happens when the child or the victim does tell someone about it and they receive an unsupportive response. Because then they lose trust even further. They're betrayed even further. They go into shame and self-blame even further. And it's that is actually related to even more poor outcomes. Instead, what is the hope? Supportive responses. Many studies have actually shown that when support is given to the victim, when they tell about what happened to them and there is support, we'll talk about what that support looks like again in the last session. But when a caregiver, someone close to them, gives them support, they have better psychological outcomes. All of those effects that we talked about, they are changed. And several studies found that the single best predictor of whether someone gets healing and resiliency is receiving supportive responses throughout their journey. Now this gives us so much hope because this is something we can change. Every single person here can change this today. That in the community, the way we talk about it, this issue, are we making sure that we are not in any way blaming or shaming or guilting those who go through it? Are we giving a positive sense and support to the victims? Right? Now, there are many others, also small factors associated with healing and resiliency. For example, those related to making sure they have a very strong supportive network, a common positive sense of community, belonging to different religious communities and having a strong, higher connection of spirituality and religiosity. It's all been shown in the literature. So alhamdulillah for this. This is what I say. Alhamdulillah for this. We are grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we have a way that we can actually change and prevent the severe effects of the abuse. All right. So let's take that 1 minute break and I'll ask you again, what's the most important thing you've learned in this section? All right, alhamdulillah, we got through another interactive question and I saw all the great comments that yes, there is hope after all, right? And inshallah, in the next section, the next two sessions, we are going to be going into a lot more detail about the exact things that we should be saying, the exact responses we should be giving, and what each and every single person in the community, what their role has to be in this exactly. So please stay tuned for those sessions as well. We don't have time to get into that today. All right, so let's go on, inshallah. As I mentioned, we're going to come back to this analogy of the tree, right? So now we've done the trunk of the tree, we've done the effects of the tree. The next thing we need to understand is, why does it happen, right? Those questions of that, what we call the risk factors. What are those risk factors? So to understand this, I'm going to share this statement. It's a complicated statement, but we'll go through it and explain it individually. Child sexual abuse occurs at the complex interaction of multiple levels of risk and protective factors. What does that mean? Let's go into detail. Now, for a second, for just 2 minutes, I want you to forget about child sexual abuse. And I want you to think about a different example, something that generally everyone is familiar with in the community. You might have heard it being talked about a lot: obesity, right? It's another public health issue. And oftentimes when we talk about public health issues or community problems, we often talk about them as though they are simple, right? As though, we know what causes them. And that's not true, right? We think that the cause is the same for every community, and we can easily find a solution for it. So what will you often hear with obesity? What are the causes? If you just on your top of your mind, you'd say, what are the causes of obesity? Almost everyone would say, oh, it's what you eat, and it's how active you are, right? That's what causes obesity. But in fact, from a public health perspective, after years and years and years of research on obesity, the real problem actually looks like this. Now, this is a diagram from a real study on obesity, a landmark study that explained the actual risk factors, numerous risk factors for obesity, and how they're connected, and how we have to work on all of these different issues in different ways in order if we wanted to address obesity. And so our challenge is now to figure out, what does this system map? What are the risk factors? What does this look like for child sexual abuse in our community? Because it has to be specific to each community. And that's a longer process that I'm doing in my research as well, is to work on this for child sexual abuse in our community. So why is this important? Why am I emphasizing this? Because when we as a community understand that the problem is complex and that the problem lives in this very complicated space, only then can the real change actually happen, because we can start to address the real issues, right? Which was going to be the next one. But so far, we're talking about risk factors, right? Not necessarily the very root problem, but just what are those risk factors that we often see talked about in the research. So in order to understand this, you're going to see me give you another model for public health. And this is probably one of my favorite public health models that actually convinced me to switch from medicine into public health. But that's another story. So the question is, what are those factors that contribute to child sexual abuse? And we look at this from this model. And this model basically shows, I want you to just focus on this individual, that starting at the individual level, when you have an individual child, let's say a person, they are not only whatever their experiences are, their knowledge and their understandings, but they are also affected, and there's factors that affect them from their family life, from their friends, from their schools, which is the institution, or their religious institutions. All of those are in the institutional level. And then they're also affected by the community, by their neighborhood, by what kinds of community processes are going on. And they're also affected by the policies that are at play. So, in order to understand this for the level of child sexual abuse, we're going to go through each of these levels separately and looking at what are those risk factors that have been studied in the research. Now, I am showing you what the research discusses, and this could be itself its own presentation, so I'll try to summarize it as best as possible. However, there's many others that are not in the research, right, that are actually very important for our community. And those are things that, inshallah, we might talk about in the next session. So let's start with what I mean by this. The first is, in the individual, what are those victim characteristics? Now, it's very important to understand, again, child sexual abuse is never in any way the responsibility or the fault of the individual, of the victim. But there are, at the same time, there are certain factors that the research shows it might be more. And for example, we mentioned more in girls. We mentioned certain ages. I talked to you already about the disability. I think I haven't talked to you about prior victimization. So research indicates that the people who have experienced sexual abuse before have a 3 to 5 times increased risk of being a victim again when compared to those who have not gone through child sexual abuse. In fact, they are a victim not only in their childhood, but they also can become victims even in adulthood. And there's different theories for this. The next thing that's probably discussed in the research a lot, but it's almost as an assumption, and I want to challenge this assumption for each and every one of us. Researchers often think that a children's lack of knowledge about sexual development or appropriate sexual behavior, or generally knowing about the types of sexual abuse, things like that, will increase their risk for child sexual abuse. However, this has not been explicitly studied or found to be a risk or protective factor. What I mean by this is this. I just want to ask you this question. Much of our research and around the world, all the interventions, not all, but a majority of the interventions have been focused on this individual, on the victim. For example, you might have seen things like bad touch, good touch, right? Things like this. And while these are important efforts, I agree, they are important efforts. But I have a question. If this is the only thing that we are doing to stop child sexual abuse, what are we teaching our children? Aren't we teaching them that it's their fault? That they are responsible for stopping the abuse? Why are we not teaching and doing so much else? There should be so much else more that has to be done to stop child sexual abuse. So it's very crucial we all understand it's not going to stop by only educating a victim who in fact could not stop it in the first place, right? That's why they are the victim. Okay. So let's not stop at the individual level. Now, looking at there are some, for example, abuser or offender characteristics. So we talked about gender being male, we talked about age being adults and teenagers. Now, this concept of prior abuse often comes up. So, for example, people often say, well, there's a cycle of abuse. Those who abuse, they abuse others. Now, we need to explain this a little bit. So, this is very important to understand. There's a big misconception about this. The majority of child sexual abuse victims never go on to abuse others. They do not become offenders. Yes, some studies show that people who are abusers might have been likely to be sexually abused in their past when they're compared to the general population. However, when compared to the general population, child sexual abuse victims do not go on to abuse more frequently than others. So this concept and the link that everyone who has been abused is going to go on to abuse, this is not true. The next is the specific types of attitudes and beliefs, and this is something we're going to come back to. So please remember this. What are the specific attitudes and beliefs that makes an abuser actually do the abuse? All right. So let's go on to the next level, the interpersonal level. What does that mean? There are certain risk factors at the home environment, right? We mentioned, for example, the types of people that are living in the home. But there's also, for example, if there is substance abuse going on in the home, for example, alcohol or drugs that are already present in the parents, then that creates a difficult. If there's already family dysfunction inside the home, meaning the parents are not getting along and the child, doesn't really have a trustworthy adult, doesn't really have someone they can go to, or in some way they feel that they need to, when an abuser gives them some kind of affection, then they're more inclined towards that. Different kinds of family structure. So specifically, we talked about having step parents or stepchildren, those kinds of things, or big, large families living together. And the parent-child relationship. Now, this has not been shown exactly to be, have a strong risk factor, but the concept of that parent-child relationship is being studied currently. It has not been studied enough. That what kinds of specific trust, what kinds of things can we say between parents and child in order to make sure that we're protecting them. So that is something that's being researched, and we'll talk about in the next session as well. The next risk factors are at the institutional level. So what is that specific environment that is going on in a school or in a daycare or in a mosque or in a sporting institution or many others? Wherever that child is interacting, what is that environment? Is the environment one that the child feels safe in or that the child is safe in? Is it one that takes into account and takes seriously the risk of child sexual abuse? And this is something we can all do. We can all go ask. Do they have kinds of background checks? If a child tells them that someone is doing this, do they look into it? Are we making sure that we are telling our children that whenever you have to go talk to a teacher or another adult, make sure there's someone else with you. Don't ever go alone. Are the schools and daycares and mosques making sure that their leaders and their teachers and educators are trained in this? And making sure that whenever they're talking to children, that it's not behind a closed door alone, that there are windows that you can see in, that people can see, that's in public space, right? All these kinds of things can be made in those institutions to completely protect this. It has been shown. And also, even from the leadership, is the leadership one that respects women and children? The next is at the community level. So at the community level, what is that neighborhood structure? For example, it's been shown that when there's a neighborhood that's very closely intact, right? That they support one another, that there's resources and there's support for the families, right? That the families know exactly where they're going to go to, then the abuser is less likely to take advantage of them in that situation, right? On the other hand, if there's a community in which sexual violence is tolerated, it's pushed under the table, it's swept under the rug, nobody wants to talk about it. Or people see that someone heard about it and it's just hush hush, right? Don't talk about it, don't make a big deal about it. Just get on with it, get over it. When those are the kinds of things that are going on, that is a community in which abuse is going to thrive. And then finally, at the policy level, when there's a lack of clear policies, for example, where do you go when you have to report this issue? When there's a lack of, and for example, if you do try to report it, are there people stopping you in between? When there's a lack of justice, and when there's a lack of accountability at all levels, across the world, this is an issue across the world, not just in our community, especially in our community, but across everywhere. When abusers are not taken to account because we don't have a system yet that has a way to take the abuser to account. Again, going back to that issue of people thinking that it's only rape, right? It's only penetration. So when we don't have these kinds of systems in place, then that's a risk factor for abuse to keep happening. So by showing this, I want to bring around the question, because this figure shows that, you might have heard the phrase that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, we also have to realize that this was actually mentioned in one of the court cases. It takes a village to abuse a child as well. It's not just one person abusing, right? Because if you look at many historical cases, children, like when there's, for example, one abuser who's abusing many children, every time I've looked at them, the child and the families did tell someone. They told someone. But it kept getting hidden, it kept getting silenced, it kept getting put away, and nothing happened. So yes, the abuser is completely responsible, but us living in this society, in this community, every single one of us, we are also responsible. What are we doing about it? Now, because our time is less, I'll just maybe go for 30 seconds, and you all can write down as well, that from those risk factors that I mentioned, What was the most surprising thing you learned in this section? All right, so as I mentioned that we have less time, inshallah. I'm almost, we're getting to the end, and so I do want to make sure we get to a good place, right? And as I mentioned before, that I know that this topic can for sure be something that is triggering for many of us, right? For many people, that this can be something that's very difficult to hear and go through and think about what happened to someone. So let's make sure that our responses, as we mentioned, are supportive, right? And those who have experienced it, let's make sure that we have avenues. In fact, if you want to contact us on the official number, we have a counselor, right? Or we can refer you to other counselors as well. And we are going to, inshallah, start a support group for this very issue, so that victims and those who have gone through it and their family members, we can all have a supportive place that we can discuss these issues. That is, inshallah, the goal at the end of the session, to start that support group, to make a change. Okay, so inshallah, now, in the last 10 minutes of this session, I want us to really, let's get energized, all right? Let's get energized and try to figure out the last question that I asked, right? I kept saying we're going to keep asking why. Why? And then the question is, why do we have to keep asking why? Why wasn't that enough, what I just told you? All those risk factors, why wasn't that enough? Because we have to ask the right question. Now this is very crucial, right? So let's look at this. If we are asking why does child sexual abuse really happen? Now you might say, well, what about all those risk factors? You just told us why it happens. No. That question, and in fact, I didn't realize this until very recently. I've been doing so much research on this. I've been going into all the risk factors and what is this and what causes this and what increases the risk. But we were asking the wrong question. The question we were asking, all of those answers I just gave you, is why was that child abused? Because that's the sort of community question that everyone keeps asking. But let's change this today. Let's change this today. We're not going to ask, why was that child abused? We are going to ask, why did that person abuse? What made that person abuse? And this is the change in mindset. This is a change in mindset that I wanted to get at. Because if we are actually going to change what is happening, if we're actually going to get at the root of the problem, we have to ask the right questions so we can address the right issue. Right? Remember that analogy of the tree? What is the soil? What is the conditions that continues to make a person abuse or continues to make abusers in our society? What is it? What's the one thing? So if we look at this, is there anything that you see on here so far that if that thing was taken away, child sexual abuse would stop? No. There's nothing here. So how can we say that we know the cause of child sexual abuse? We'll notice, that the majority of this research, if you look at the vast majority of research, the vast majority of the interventions that have been done, it's not asking the question, why did that person abuse? Because instead we need to be asking, what are the systems, what are the conditions that allow for the abuse to happen? But the reason why we aren't doing that is because it is a very, very difficult question to ask. And it's a very difficult thing to recognize and to admit in our society. So, the question, when I ask the question, this question, the most common answer that I receive is, people try to think about it. People are really sincerely trying to figure out, okay, why do we think, if I asked you, why do you think this happens? What's the real cause? Many people, their first understanding, because of what we've been told our whole lives, is that people abuse because of their sexual desires. Sometimes people might say, well, they have repressed sexual desires, or they can't get their desires out, or they can't control them, whatever, these kinds of comments. And to be honest, I searched and searched for this because I really wanted to figure out, is this true? And what I found out is no, this is not the cause of child sexual abuse. Yes, everyone has sexual desires. There's not a single man, and I'm only saying men because they're the ones who are abusers, that's what we're talking about, who has not had sexual desires towards someone else, and even had access that they could act it out. So, what is then the difference between those who have sexual desires and access and they act it out versus those who have sexual desires and access and they don't act it out? What is the difference? If that's not the difference, then what is the difference? And this is where there is something, this red arrow, there is something that has been found in the research that goes throughout all of these levels. It affects every single one of these levels, leads to every single one of these risk factors, and has in fact been found as the root, soil, conditions, and cause for child sexual abuse. What is it? Sexual abuse and violence lies at the nexus of power and control. Now that's a complicated statement, so let's try to understand what this means, right? Where does the issue of power and control come from? Again, I mentioned if you looked all the way back to the very beginning of our slides, you'll realize the thing that links all of this is that the difference between the people who abuse and the people who have sexual desires and access and don't abuse, the difference is their need to take control or exert their control over another person's body. And it's that lying at that issue of power and control, that where does that come from? And to understand this better, I understand that for many people this is actually a very difficult concept to understand, and this is my goal, inshallah, is to figure out a way to explain this in a way that makes sense to the majority of our community. Because what promotes this? And I think one way of understanding, where does this issue of power and control come from, and what do we really mean by power and control? Let's examine the root things that promote this sexual abuse, in which someone feels like they have the right and they can exert their right and control and taking advantage of someone else's body. Right? It means they lack respect for that body. So what causes this? Number one is the sexualization of children. So this is in our hypersexual society nowadays. It's been getting worse and worse. But the primary promoter of this is the pornography industry. Pornography is not just showing sex on screen. Pornography almost always includes an aspect of violence, an aspect of controlling the person's body in a violent way. So mixing sex and violence together, number one. And number two, we see that in the pornography industry, children are being used more and more frequently, or people who have features and characteristics of children. So this is number one. When people see and are addicted to pornography, which is a root cause here, when that addiction of pornography exists, it has been shown in the literature that itself leads to someone wanting to act out and control and disrespect another person's body. And they feel like they have the right to do that because they see that on the screen over and over and over again. The next thing is the media representation of these abuses and of these acts and of children. We see in more and more movies and media how much sexualization of children is happening and how it seems to be okay. It's okay to sexualize and control a child's body. It's okay to sexualize and control another person's body and look at them and degrade them in certain ways. The next is lack of consequences. What does that mean? In our society, when there is a lack of consequences for a person who degrades a child or a woman's body, when there's lack of consequences for someone who continuously talks in a degrading way, who continuously looks in a degrading way, Why not? Why wouldn't someone then want to use their power and their control and get that feeling of having power and control over someone else's body? So this immense lack of consequences throughout, from our family level to our community, to our institutions, to our policy, it's throughout. But beyond everything else, beyond all of these, because these are also still things that happen as a result of something else. Beyond everything, I want you to answer this question. If we raised our children to respect other people's bodies, meaning other children, meaning women, meaning men, if we raised our boys just as we raise our girls about the respect they're supposed to have towards other people's bodies, and what I mean by bodies, I mean the way they talk about them, the way they look at them, and of course the way they interact with them. If we changed that and we actually focused on that, do you think that there would be any abuse in our society? Can you imagine someone who respects children's and women's bodies? Could they ever abuse, despite having sexual desires and despite having access? No, they could not, because it would prevent them, right? And when I say respect, I don't mean just by saying it, right? It has to be something that's taught from the time they're a child. And this is something that I've discussed with many people. What happens when boys in our community, around the world, and in our community, what happens when they are young? They are surrounded by people, even from a young age, they're surrounded by people who start talking about women and other children, or looking at that girl. Oh, look at that girl, look at what she's wearing. They're looking. Even in our society, even people who are, outwardly might think that they are a specific way. So not only are they teaching the boy that it's okay to talk that way, it's okay to look at women, it's okay to degrade women, children in that way. And the next thing is the difference that we have between how boys and girls are raised in our own homes. In our own homes. What's the difference? You all know, I'm sure. There is nothing that, I have a long story about this, but I don't have time to get into it now. But just to say that I once met someone who the only thing she knew about Islam, she was a Muslim, she had been raised Muslim, but she had no knowledge of anything about the Quran or the Sunnah, even the Prophet ﷺ. The only thing she knew about Islam was that her mother told her that in Islam, your brother is allowed to go out and have a girlfriend, and you are not. You have to stay home. That's the only thing she knew about Islam. She came to me, she was ready to leave Islam because of that. So when our children, and another example is someone came, in one of my interviews, she was explaining how, her whole life as a child, when she was very, very young, she had no idea about anything related to sex, but the only thing she found out is that her aunts and uncles came to her and told her, you look like you're developing, so you're starting to develop, you need to stop playing with the boys. You need to stop playing with those children. She said to me, why didn't anybody go to the boys? Why didn't anybody tell the boys to stop playing with me and to not do those things? Why is it all the focus is on the girls? And again, it's back to our victim, focusing only on the victim. And it's not only in our community, I'm trying to say this, it's across the board. But, for example, I also heard of a great example of this, a positive example, in which a Muslim family, the mother was so attentive, and she recognized, the cousins were playing as we normally do, all the boy cousins and all the girl cousins, and she noticed the boy cousins, were starting to take the girl cousin away and do, just play around alone with her. Nothing too serious. And instead, we need to, and what did she do? The girls told me that she never came to them and told them to stop playing with the boys. Instead, she went to her sister, who was the khala and the sons, right? Went to them and said, your boys are getting older, and both the adults and the children told them, it's time that you make sure whenever you're playing, you can come over, you can play, just make sure that you're not alone with the girl. Simple. Prevented so much harm. Prevented so much damage to the girls. And what did that do? That showed those boys that they are responsible for their actions. This is something that we have not instilled in our boys. Have we taught them from a young age that they are responsible for their actions? They are responsible for their words. They are responsible for the way they look, think, and talk and act towards other children and other adults. So I think I've spent too much time talking about this, but this is sort of where we're going to end today's session. And we are going to continue, inshallah, next session in going into what? Let's talk about what we're going to go into the next time. Inshallah. So let's preview into our next sessions by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So next week, inshallah, we're going to continue this discussion that we just started, talking about what are the evidence-based things that we can change to prevent child sexual abuse from happening. What does that mean? And we are specifically going to be taking a look within our Muslim community, all right? So we're going to have, inshallah, Ustaza Aisha Khatak. She's also going to be with me discussing this. I'll be asking her some questions, and she'll be answering some things that I've found in my research from the Islamic perspective. So please don't miss that. What are we going to do? Well, today we talked about these 4 things. Now, next time, we're going to talk about how to change at each level. What are the changes? What are the interventions that have been shown in the evidence that we can do to try to cut the tree down, to try to take out the roots, or to try to change the conditions of that soil that's allowing the tree to grow? And then in the time after that, when we talk about healing from child sexual abuse, in 2 weeks, inshallah, by the will of Allah, we're going to be talking about this. What is going to help the victims heal? We gave a little peek into it today, but we're going to have another expert, Dr. Venus Mahmoudi. She's going to talk about, she's a psychological expert, a PhD in psychology, and she's going to talk about what are the things that we can do to help victims heal, either from the victim's perspective and also from the family and the community's perspective. What are the things that we can do to change the way these leaves grow? The rain, the humidity, the airflow in our community. What can we do to help? And inshallah ta'ala, with these 3 sessions, right, we're going to try to figure this out together, inshallah, as a community. Because we need to make sure that not only do we, by the end of these 3 sessions, inshallah, we're going to figure out how to make sure that we've trimmed these trees so they don't have any more effects. We're going to figure out how we can chop down the tree when we need to immediately. We're going to figure out how we can, over time, remove the roots of this tree so that it doesn't affect our foundation and our community. And we're going to work together to figure out how we're going to change this soil so that it doesn't grow, this tree doesn't grow in someone else's house right next to us. All right? Inshallah ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept each and every single one of you for being here and for listening to this session. I think this is a huge step forward for each and every one of us, for our community. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from each and every single one of you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase you all in goodness, make you all a means of change and a means of khair for our society and our community, and bringing about a way to stop this. And those who have experienced it, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala find a way to heal each and every one of you with a complete healing, in which you can reach that very high level of healing and resiliency, in which you can make a difference in society. Ameen. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept the good that we have from this and to forgive us for anything we might have said wrong or anything that came wrong out of it. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.